Now there are some standard elements available in JavaServer Pages. 3 types: directive, scripting, and action. The directive has these 3 types of element. Scripting has got these 3, and action has got those 9. And we'll talk about some of those in this lecture. Those that aren't covered, you can get more details about in books and online. So let's look at the include directive. This is a statement that we can insert at any point in the JavaServer page, and at that point that it's inserted, that will be the place where the contents of the nominated file, in this case XXX, will be inserted to replace the include directive. This is a physical insertion of the file's contents into the data stream that comes out of this JavaServer page. The only thing to note really is that the file that is inserted cannot be a dynamic file. It has to be a static file. It cannot be a servlet or a JavaServer page. So it would have to be a text file or an HTML file or something like that. And we can have as many of these include directives as we want. We know that it's a directive because after the less than % sign there is an @ symbol, and that tells us that this is a directive. Another directive, and we've already met one version of them, is the page directive, and we can list one or more attributes such as language, which is the one that we've seen already, where we specify that the language is Java, which by the way is the only language available for JavaServer Pages at this point. We can specify, for example, the error page, which is nominating the JavaServer page that should be invoked should an exception occur in this page. We could set also this attribute, is error page. If that is set to true, then the exception implicit variable will be made available to that page. Is error page set to false means that the exception implicit variable will not be available. So let's look at a few of these attributes. Content type. We can specify what kind of value that is and what kind of information is being sent back to the web browser. That is a standard piece of information that is typically sent back to web browsers. And if you have a look at some of the header information on a web browser page or a page that the web browser is displaying, you'll find that this content type will have been set. It could be HTML, and of course our clients thus far have all been web browsers processing HTML. But it could be other things like text/XML and so on. The error page I've already mentioned. The import. Now this is quite useful because when we're writing our Java code that's inside the JavaServer page, there are times when we want to make use of classes that are outside of the scope of this class as it will be when it's generated. And so we would want to insert things. For example, java.util.vector or java.util.date or calendar or whatever. And so we've got a choice. If we want to import them, then we would have to have the page directive import equals, and then in double quotes, the class or package that we want to import. We could have multiple imports by putting in a separate page directive for each one, or we could have a single import page directive and list all the imports, separating the various items with a comma. Now let's think about this declaration element. We have to be really careful with this. And the reason is because when we do a declaration, we can tell it's a declaration because of the exclamation mark here. What happens is that that declaration becomes an instance variable of the servlet. Now in the last lecture we were talking about thread safety. And if we declare object variables in our servlets, we could, if we're not very careful, violate thread safety of the servlet. And because this JavaServer page is going to end up as a servlet, then we have to be very careful about thread safety for that as well. And in fact, if I come back up a couple of pages, we can see here we are declaring is thread safe equals true or is thread safe equals false, because it's possible for us to violate thread safety by making an unwise declaration of an object level variable, and thus we should say is thread safe equals false. But if we've been very careful about thread safety, and we've not done any declarations that are going to violate thread safety, then we can set is thread safe to true. Whatever declaration we put in there, it has to be a valid declaration for, in this case, Java. So for example, we could put, instead of XXX, we could put int num, semicolon. Having made that declaration, it will then, in the conversion process from the JSP to the servlet, it will be put within the servlet class, but outside of any method. And that's what violates the thread safety if we're not very careful. A scriptlet element. This is what I said I'd tell you about a little bit earlier. This is where we embed our Java code. The XXX can be any number of valid Java statements. So here we have an example of the code where we're declaring a num. That is not a declaration like this one is. This is a declaration of a variable, and it will end up as a variable that is local to the method. It's not an object level variable because it isn't declared as a declaration element. It's declared as part of the Java code. And this Java code will be inserted into the method. It's not called the process request method in the generated servlet, but if we were writing it in NetBeans, that's the method that we would put it in the process request method. So all of these scriptlets will end up inside the process request method or its equivalent in the generated servlet file. And you can see in this example we've got several statements. We've got a declaration of a variable that is initialized to the value of the username parameter on the request. There's an if statement, and within the if statement there's an assignment. So we can put whatever kind of Java code we like in there. Therefore, it is feasible that we could use a JavaServer page as a model component within our MVC architecture. And that model component could interact with a database and extract information and so on and so forth. But if you're going to go to all of those lengths, then probably you ought to be doing that inside a servlet rather than a JavaServer page. So typically, a JavaServer page will be used for view components. An expression element is introduced with the standard less than % and then has an equals. And as I mentioned earlier, that is equivalent to having a scriptlet that does out.print and then the value. And the thing we have to note about this value, XXX, is that it must be a valid expression that yields a result that is either a string or could be converted to a string. So we have, for example, the string strut that is equal to hello, and we can output that in an expression element, because that's a string, no problem. In the other example here, num, which has got the value 5, times 6 equals 30, this is of type int. That's okay, because it can, the value 30 as an integer, can be converted into a string, and therefore the expression element that says I want you to output num times 6 is okay. That will work. You could have an expression in there that is a Boolean expression. Again, that Boolean value, true or false, can be converted to a string. So that's not a problem. You have to be a bit careful about putting objects there, because if you just put the object reference, then you'll probably find, unless you've written the toString method, that what you get is the default output from toString, which is going to be the class name, then an @ sign, and then its address in memory. If you want to put an object reference inside an expression element, make sure you override the toString method. Now, the include element is different from the include directive. Remember, the include directive is the insertion of a static file, whereas the include element is essentially what we've done already with servlets when we have included the response of another servlet as part of this servlet's output back to the client. And that's what's happening here. The nominated page is going to be the URL of the page, or indeed the servlet, that will be included as part of the output. So this can be a dynamic page. It could be a static file, but it's most likely to be a servlet or JavaServer page. And as with servlets, so it is with JSP, when you use the JSP : include element, the flow of execution will jump to the nominated page or servlet, and then when that page or servlet has concluded its execution, then control of execution will jump back to this statement and will then continue with whatever comes next. Please note that XXX is not the servlet name, it's the servlet URL, just as it is when we're dispatching a request from a servlet to another servlet. On the other hand, if we're including a JavaServer page, then the URL of that JavaServer page is, in fact, the name of the JavaServer page file. Similarly, we've got the forward element, the JSP forward. This works in the same way. The nominated page or servlet is specified here, and as with servlets, so with JSP, the flow of execution does not return to this page. So there's not any point putting any statements after the forward. Now the param element can be used in conjunction with the include and forward elements. And what we're able to do with these is to specify additional request parameters. So the request that has come to this JavaServer page can have parameters on it, and we then can add to it. Now this is something that we can do in JavaServer Pages that we're not able to do in the servlet. So what we'll do is, in between the JSP include and the end tag, we can insert a number of param tags. The difference between what we're looking at now and the previous examples, which I'll just pop back to, is that because there is no end tag, we don't need to have any other tags as part of this tag's body. We can terminate that tag immediately with that slash there. Whereas here, because we want to put some other tags inside this tag's body, we don't terminate it in that way. We have the end tag, as we might be familiar with HTML tags. So here we have a JSP param tag, which consists of two attributes, the name and the value. So we specify the name of the parameter and its value. Bear in mind that these are going to be strings. So even if you've got an integer that you want to display, that integer will still end up being represented as a string. And so in the included or forwarded page, we will then have to call the request.getParameter, specifying the name as it's written in the param tag. And remember, it comes to us as a string, so if it actually is representing an integer, we'd then have to do an integer.parseInt to convert it back to an integer.